Hi, I'm Kristen. Welcome to Scrap Fabric Love Scrap Blocks Quilt Along. So in this Quilt Along, which is going to last for about 8 weeks, we're going to try and use up all sorts of your scraps and leftover fabric from other quilting projects. So today I'm going to start by showing you 2 layout options for this sampler quilt. I'm going to talk about the first block that we're doing for week 1 and then give you kind of an optional block to be getting on with if you're super keen and quick. There are timestamps in the description if you want to jump to a particular place. So behind you are some of the blocks that are in the quilt. I've obviously been testing and playing out with them, but I will be making both layouts along with you as well. But first I want to talk about kind of where I'm coming from with the Quilt Along, and we can kind of set the parameters and so everybody knows what we're doing. So this is my second ever Quilt Along that I've organized, and I already know from some of you have signed up. I know some of you, this is your first Quilt Along. So that's fine. You won't have any expectations of how it's supposed to go. But some people will have done loads of Quilt Alongs, and this one might be a tiny bit different because my brain doesn't totally work the same way as people who've been quilting for 30 years, right? So I'm going to do it my way because I'm running it. sounds kind of harsh, but anyway, that's what we're doing. So first off, the Quilt Along is meant to be stress-free, as always. I said this in the last one, and it's the same with this one. We're not worrying about anything. If a block isn't working out and we don't like it, we're going to replace it, swap it out. You know, we're just not going to stress. If we don't have exactly the same right fabric, we're going to just get creative, okay? So for that reason, I've not sent you, and I won't be sending you, fabric requirements for the entire quilt or cutting instructions for the entire quilt. This week is not going to be a cutting week. We're going to go straight to the first block, as I said. And all I asked you to do before the sew along started, and now if you're just starting now, it doesn't matter, is try and sort of group your scraps into colors. You need your biggest pile of scraps, whatever that is, and that's going to be your background color. So for my row quilt, that's this navy blue. And so I've got different kinds of navy solids. I've got navy prints. So I'll show you, this is my little bin of navy scraps. Then I have another box of navy crumbs, and obviously I've used some of it because I've started with the row quilt. And then for my sampler quilt, my background's going to be lots of whites and low volumes, something we all have lots of scraps of probably. And then my accent color here is kind of a pink, mostly a hot pink, but it's like pink. So that's my little bin of pink. And I've got another crumb box of pink as well. So, and I don't know that I necessarily have enough to finish all the blocks. I think I do. I'm estimating, you know, but if I don't, then I'll improvise. I'll have a row of the quilt that's got a different accent color or a different background color. Or, you know, if you don't have big piles of one color, you could have a different background color for each row or each block or whatever. So the whole point is to use up your scraps. So if you get together your pile of background fabric scraps and we get 2/3 of the way through the Quilt Along and you run out, fabulous. Come and give me a high five. We used up your scrap fabric, right? And so then you have a choice. You either make your quilt smaller and just finish it off there, no problem. Or yeah, you make a choice and you add on some other color, an accent color, and you just make your quilt a little bit more unique. There's nothing wrong with that, okay? So what I don't want is for anybody to go out and be buying fabric for this quilt. The point of this is to use up your scraps. So if I gave you the fabric requirements, the cutting requirements, some of you would go out and possibly buy some fabric because you didn't think you had enough. I'm not saying that's you, but if it is you, you know. And similarly, if I gave you all the cutting requirements at the beginning, some people would cut for the whole quilt, make a few blocks, and then shove it in the corner. Again, I'm not saying that's you, but if it is you, you'll know. And I just think we can just skip that whole week. We don't need to do that. Okay? I'm gonna give you the fabric requirements for each block as we do it. So you're gonna work like that. Okay? And if that stresses you out, we're going to try and get a bit more zen about that. It's just going to be an exercise in doing things a little bit differently. Okay. And it just happens to be the way my brain works. This is why I don't totally love patterns, because the instruction is to cut everything endlessly. And I just want to start with one block and see how I go. Anyway. Okay. So that out the way. So in order to keep you right for the sew along, what we're doing each week, you really need to be on the email list. So the sew along is free. As I said in the intro video, there is one block, this one, heart one, which is part of a bigger quilt pattern that I've designed that I'm going to be releasing during the quilt along. It's not the quilt we're making, because it's just basically this block. But if you want to use this block pattern, you would need to buy that pattern. However, there's going to be alternatives. So I will tell you about that in that week. So if you don't like that, you don't want to buy it, you don't have to. But you do need to be on the email list. There'll be a subscription to that in the description of the video. So you click show more underneath the title of the video and it'll pop open, and then there'll be a link where you can sign up by email, and I'll be sending out each week the video for what we're doing, as well as any handouts. So there's going to be, so this quilt is kind of a mix of improv sewing, crumb quilting, foundation paper piecing, and a little bit of traditional piecing. So some weeks I will be sending you out free foundation paper piecing patterns for some of the blocks, which for some of them they're optional. So it's kind of like some of them you can piece them traditionally, but I will be piecing them foundation paper piece. So I'm going to send you what I'm using. That there's going to be kind of handouts and things like that. And I know people weren't always getting notifications in the last quilt along of each video. The other thing is, I know not everyone is going to do the sew along, and this is a block based quilt, sampler quilt. So it's going to be lots of different blocks, some of which we've done before on the channel. So some weeks I'll be pointing you to older videos, but sometimes it'll be a new block that I'm doing that week. So when I do that video, it won't necessarily have the sew along on the sort of cover of the video when you see it on YouTube, because it'll just be a standalone block tutorial. So you'll need to get the emails to understand how we're going to use it in the quilt. Now I'll have some other videos, explains how to put the whole thing together, but I'm just trying to make sure nobody gets confused or lost or whatever. So if you're wanting to do the sew along, the only thing you really need to do is sign up for those free emails, and you'll get loads of freebies along the way with it. Even if you don't finish the quilt, you'll get some of these free block patterns that are not going to be kind of anywhere else. So I hope that all makes sense. I feel like I'm doing a lot of talking. Okay, so I'm going to show you the two layouts. They're both lap size. They're slightly different sizes, but I'll show you them now.
So this is the row, what I'm calling the row-based sampler quilt. It's 66 by 76 inches, and that includes the border, and you're going to be doing 8 different types of block, and it'll be 25 blocks in total. I know if you're a beginner, this might look a bit intimidating, but I promise you we're going to break it all down, and it's going to be totally doable. And this is the less linear sort of sampler quilt layout. It's 62 by 62 inch, including the borders. You're doing one less type of block, but you're doing more crumb blocks for this one. But there are opt-outs for all the blocks, so it's kind of optional. If you don't want to do that many crumb blocks, you don't have to. And also the color choices, these are my color choices for both of these layouts, so you can go totally a different way with that, of course.
So the first block that we're going to start with this week is not actually in the top row of the quilt. So we're not going to necessarily be going in order. It's the Improv Hexagon log cabin block, which I've done a video before on the channel. So it's this one here. So we start with a little hexagon. It can be any size, but you'll see in that video if you watch it, and then strips of any size, and depending on what size your strips are, your little hexagon is going to be somewhere else in the block. It's not necessarily going to be centered. So that's what I'm doing for the row quilt. So I've done my 2. They're 12. They have to finish at 12.5 inches. So that's where you're trimming them down to. And you'll see in that video, you know, what it looks like before we trim it down and make it look pretty like that. But for the sampler quilt version, where you're going to make a bigger block, 18.5 inches, sorry, that we're going to trim it down to. So for that one, I'm going to show you how I'm going to do that in this video. And I'm starting with a larger hexagon, and I'm going to use thicker strips than I used here. So more of like a jelly roll width strip. And so it's probably going to turn out a little bit more centered than this. So it's just two different ways of doing it. You can do the bigger one this way, like in the video that will be linked in the description or up above, and it will be in the email you get. Or you can do it in the more structured, let's do it with 2.5-inch strips way. It's just because that block's so much bigger to get that block done quicker. So that's the first block. So you're doing, if you're doing the row quilt, you're doing two 12.5-inch of these, and the instructions are in the link in the description, or one 18.5-inch for the larger sampler quilt version, the one with less blocks, right? Then the optional extra blocks are the crumb blocks. So in the row quilt, there's going to be two 12.5-inch like plain color crumb blocks, and I have videos for that as well. So there's a video for a one color crumb quilt block, and I've got another crumb block. I'm just going to give both of the crumb block videos that I have in the description and in the email I'm going to send you, just so that you can watch either one if you've never done crumb quilting before. And then there's going to be some smaller ones again in the row quilt, and more of them in the, this is the one where there are a few more in the sampler quilt. So and we're going to sash those in both cases. So we're going to be, but we'll do that later. So if you already have crumbs, or you already have color coordinated crumb blocks, you could be either just trimming them down or going along and making your crumb blocks as you go. So you don't have to finish these this week, and you don't even have to start these this week. So if you're someone who has bigger scraps and you don't have crumbs yet, you will have them by the time we do the other blocks. So you could wait and do these later. So I know I'm talking quickly, and there's like requirements for the different quilts. So again, get yourself on the email list, and then I'm going to send you which blocks, how many crumb blocks and what size for each of the two quilt layouts. Okay. I should have just done one layout, but I've already done the two, and now I'm going with it. So anyways, yeah. So that's the plan for this week. So it's the hexagon blocks, and if you want to, the crumb blocks, or at least just get your head around what's going to be required for the crumb blocks for later on, so you can be kind of planning and organizing. So I would, the reason I was showing you these as well, so obviously some of you are going to go more random with your colors, that's fine, but if you were doing like a background and one or two accent colors, I would get some sort of a container, a box, whatever, and put the sort of larger scraps in that, and then get a smaller box of some kind or some other container, so that while you're cutting and you're making scraps from your scraps, that the crumbs then can go, in another box, so that when you are going to make the crumb blocks, you don't have to go sorting around the big pile of of stuff. So that's just the way I'm keeping myself organized, because it can get messy, right?
So I started with a hexagon that had about 2.25-inch sides, as well as a whole heap of 2.5-inch strips. You need approximately the equivalent of 3 jelly roll strips for your background, and the same amount for your accent colors. I used my AccuQuilt dies to cut these, but you don't have to. I'll put the die numbers in the description, but you could also just sort of print out a hexagon shape from the computer and use that as a template, or freehand draw one. It's up to you. And although I'm saying you need the equivalent of 3 jelly roll strips for each sort of side of your hexagon block, I did not measure any of this ahead of time. I just cut a bunch of strips of the right colors into 2.5-inch strips and got sewing. So you can start with an accent color strip, so not your background color. I'm using an array of colors for this particular block, like a rainbow, but you could be just using variations of the one accent color like I did in my row quilt with the navy and pink. Anyways, we're going right sides together with this first strip, which just has to be a little bit longer than the side of your hexagon. So I think I usually do it quite a bit wider just to make sure I'm not cut short. Then once I've pressed it open, I'm cutting along the straight edge in 2 directions, like following the lines of the hexagon. And for this first piece, it's going to look a bit like a triangle, but we actually want it to look like a half hexagon, even if it's just a tiny bit. So I was measuring 2 1/4 inch from the seam line and then just lopping off that little tip. It's still going to look a bit like a triangle for this first one, but all the rest of the pieces, once you've trimmed them, should look a bit like a half hexagon. So then you add another accent strip, right side together, again, just making sure the sides are a little bit longer than what you are sewing. So you should be sewing now across that, in my case, that yellow piece plus the next side of your hexagon. So you're going around in a rotation. I have another video about this where I did it with just all sorts of different sizes of strips. So if this is going too quickly for you, you can go ahead and watch that. The cutting, the trimming, all of that is the same. All we did is we've just made our strips more of a uniform size to start off with. So they're all 2 1/2 inches in width, and that's the only thing we're doing that's different. And now here I trimmed it wrong that first time. So what I'm doing is now following the side still of the hexagon to trim it. And you can see me doing it again here. And then once it's trimmed, that should look like a half hexagon. So if you watch me doing this a few more times, it'll probably become clearer how you trim this. So I just keep adding strips. So I'm going, so whatever you want in the middle, I've done kind of an accent color in the middle, but that could have been a background color, it doesn't matter. And then 3 accent colors. And then once you've done the 3, then you're going to switch to your background color. So 3 background colors. They don't have to be the same fabric, just the same color. So if your background is white, you might have 3 different kinds of white strips that you would start adding at this point, which is what I had for this block. And if your background is navy, like my other one, you could be using, I think I was using a variety of solids mostly and some other prints and things. And what I'm doing here for each one, because some of these were not exactly 2 1/2 inches. But anyways, so I'm going ahead and trimming it to 2 1/4 inch from the seam line. So I put my ruler on the seam line and then I'm trimming it to 2 1/2 inch on the edge to make the half hexagon. I hope that makes sense. If it doesn't, just leave me a message. I'll try and explain it better in a future video. But although I was cutting some of my strips on the AccuQuilt, I also did just pull some other strips, and they might have been a bit more than 2 1/2 inches. So that was what I was doing there. So if you don't want to pre-trim, that's another way you can just make sure you're getting a uniform size as you go. But there is also that improv way where it doesn't matter if it's uniform. So we're not going to stress either way, right? So I've just sped this up here just so you can see that I just think it's easier to just see the trimming a few times to understand what we're doing, because otherwise it's super simple. All we're doing is adding a strip, pressing it, and then just trim. And the most complicated thing about this is just because you get into a rhythm with it is to kind of remember when you're switching from the colors to the background. There were a couple times when I was making this when I had to unpick strips. So just, I don't know, do some sort of mantra or count every time or something, just to make sure you're not kind of just keeping going with the color. Or if that's too annoying, just make a full colored one, I guess. I don't know. So I'm going to just show you this fast forwarded for a little bit. I won't show you the whole thing because it's pretty repetitive. And then I'm going to show you what we do when we get it. So as it gets bigger, you want to be putting some sort of a ruler up against it. I have a 20 1/2 inch square ruler. You don't need that. But for an 18 1/2 inch block, it is kind of useful. So I will link to that in the description if you want something like that, but they are pretty expensive. So you can also just use your regular ruler just to measure where you're going, or your cutting mat would be fine too. But anyways, you want to be measuring it as it's getting bigger to see when you're getting close to that 18 1/2 inch, because once we get closer, we're not going to be adding full strips to either side because we're just going to need to be finishing off some corners. So I'm going to show you that in just a sec. Okay, so now I'm at sort of, 0 down here and above 18 1/2 inches here. And I'm, over the ruler here, and I'm at 18 1/2 inches over here. So I could scooch it a bit.
maybe, yeah. But either way, regardless, I've got the corners to fill. So I'm obviously following a pattern, not a pattern, you know, like a color sequence. So I could, because I'm at green, I would do purple next. I could say I'm skipping purple and I'm going to put the next one here, but I want to have as much of the colors in. So I'm going to put purple on this side, then white down here, and then figure out what the next color would be. Yellow here, I think. Okay, and then I should be done on maybe this corner. Not sure about that corner. So then I might need to do another one. So I might do a tiny bit of orange right here. And then it should be maybe like a little bit of white, and then if I need a tiny bit there, right? So I'm using smaller pieces now. I'm not, because I know I'm going to trim this down, right? So there's no point me sewing the whole strips. Right, so the 20.5-inch ruler is underneath here now. And so I'm still trying to get to the 18.5, and I just have these corners. Now I'm going to add some yellow here, but I don't need it to go all the way to here. I just need it to be up here. So I'm going to kind of just sew it on there because I know it's going to get trimmed. You know, I could keep going with the long strips, but at this point I don't need the long strips. So I'm just going to sort of judge where I need it to be, sew it, and then when I trim it, it'll all come out good. So here's my 18.5 here. So I'm going to get this up because I kind of want that to be the top. 18.5, and then 18.5 would be about here. So everything is covered. You could really try and center that if you want to. I don't particularly care if it's in the center. So 18.5 will cut here. So it won't be on the straight line of one of these. Even though it is up here, it won't be here. It will cut one of these strips, but I want more of the color than the background. So I'm going to keep as much of the color and trim away more of the background. But it's still kind of an improv-y thing, even though we used standard sizes this time. So that's gone. That's done. Needs to be this way. Right, and now I'm going to line it up on my 18.5. Should be here. Here we go. And there's our cute block.
And so there is that one big block for the sampler version finished. And as I was going, I was color coding my scraps. The bigger bits of strips that were left over went back in that bucket for the colors that I'm using for this quilt, because I'll use them in other blocks. But the crumbs I'm separating out for making my crumb blocks as I go.
Okay, so here's our two options. We've got our large 18.5-inch done with relatively uniform 2.5-inch strips, or this one 12.5-inch done with strips of all sorts of whatever size, and it's a slightly different look, and this one probably took longer with the smaller, because there's, or maybe this, I haven't counted the number of passes, but there's probably a similar amount of sewing in both blocks. Now, of course, you could do the larger strips in the smaller block, and then you would just get less goes around, less passes around. So there'd be a different look again. But either way, so if your scraps, because people have different definitions of scraps, right? So if your scraps are leftover jelly roll strips or pre-cut 2.5-inch strips from things you have left over, then the bigger, more uniform pieces versions probably work for you. But if scraps for you are more like just anything and we don't pre-cut them and you just throw them in a bin, then maybe this version would work better for you. So yeah, just work with whatever you've got. So I hope one of those versions is going to work with you. If you have any questions, please do put them in the comments or reply to my email if you're on that list. I would love to show your progress with the sew along. So if you are on Instagram, you can use the hashtag #ScrapFabricLoveSewAlong. It's the same hashtag we used last time. Again, I'm not always on Instagram, but I'll try to be on it more for this. And also you can send in your photos either with you putting your own name on the photo or just letting me share it without a name, because I think the admin of that is going to get a bit ridiculous. There's about, I think there's almost 500 of you already signed up for the sew along. So just the idea of folks sending things in and me having to keep names straight is, yeah, I don't know. I don't think I could do it. So yeah. So I would love to see your photos and I would love to share. I don't want to put anybody off sharing, but it's just, I can't be matching photos with names unless you put your name in the actual photograph yourself somehow. So, yeah. So I hope you're as excited to get going with this as I am, and I hope to see you on the email list and to see you in the next video. Thanks so much for spending time with me. Bye.